This is a difficult time for me to take this subject matter on because of what's happening in Ukraine. There are no easy answers, and I can't help but remember the very first time I went out to speak to a group about social justice, conflict resolution, nonviolence, and the audience was pretty hostile because one of the questions that was asked was, well, how would you mediate Hitler out of Poland? And that's where we are today. We're facing a situation in which there is a rising tide of hate in this country and around the world. It's a rise of anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and it's been given the light of day. And we may even have division in our families because of our values and our beliefs. I know I do in my family. And so for many of these victims, it's an everyday transgression that's going on. They're living with the pain of being considered the other. And this nation, our nation, was built on white supremacy. And so we still live with that very much so today. And how do we, since this is an everyday occurrence for so many, how do we deal with the pain of the victims? And how do we deal with the person or persons inflicting that pain? How do we have an impact? How do we go to our family meals and deal with the kinds of racism that might be sitting at our dinner table? And so oftentimes when we are sitting at that dinner table with family members, what we find is we get triggered. And it becomes difficult for us to respond. It either shuts us down, or we just want to leave the table, or we get paralyzed by it. We don't know what to do. And we know confrontation doesn't work. We know that avoiding the subject matter seems to be the easiest way. And yet, is it really the best way? I always try to think about, I try to live my life when I'm at these crossroads, whether it's at the dinner table with family members that don't agree with you or colleagues that don't agree with you. I try to imagine there is an 8-year-old watching me. And what do I want to model for that 8-year-old? So today I'm going to take you through some of the steps of compassionate listening. And why did I choose compassionate listening? I guess because that's how I try to approach these kinds of situations. I am not an expert in any of it, even though I've been doing it for over 30 years. I still get triggered. I still will fail and leave the table because I have to recognize I've been triggered, and I need to take some deep breathing before I come back to the table, before I come back to the group. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I chose compassionate listening. I was headed to the Middle East, and I was going to be living with a rabbi and his family, and I was also going to be living in Ramallah, in the West Bank with a family. And I heard about compassionate listening, and thought, okay, this might be a good tool to have in the Middle East. And I particularly liked how Gene Knudsen, who was the founder, put it: an enemy is someone whose story we've not yet heard. And I'm going to just pause here for a moment and share with you a story. And I'll need a timekeeper because I want to make sure I don't go over my 20 minutes. But years ago, there was a hate group. The Ku Klux Klan and the White Aryan Nation was coming to Bucks County, and they were going to be marching against gays who live in that area. And people were trying to create protests and find ways to respond. And we had decided, a group of us had decided on an interfaith response. And so I was asked to go on TV, national TV, across from sitting at a table with a local gay man and someone who represented, was head of the Ku Klux Klan locally and the White Aryan Nation. And it was really a difficult hour that we spent, because I was called white trash and other names that I normally might get triggered by and argue by. But I really tried to take in Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi. I really tried to just be their breath and what they would say. And after that hour was over, I went back to the Peace Center. And as I was trying to process my day and do a little bit of work, the head of the Ku Klux Klan called me and said, "I'm here and I want to talk to you." And so he came up the stairs, and of course I only had a nanosecond to figure out, do I call the police? Do I say goodbye to my family? I was sure that, I wasn't going to come out of it okay. And when he came through the door, I said, "Why are you here?" And he said, "You didn't attack me. You didn't argue with me. You stayed really calm. So I felt like I could talk to you." And he spent the next 2 hours talking to me about how he had been having doubts about being in the Klan, and how his daughter, his 16-year-old daughter, hated what he was doing. And that his wife, and he was only in his late 30s, his wife was in the hospital very, very ill and might be dying. And so I listened. And at the end of that 2 hours, what I found was that he seemed ready to leave the Ku Klux Klan. And I tell this story as often as I can, because I couldn't reach the young man who was head of the White Aryan Nation. He wasn't ready to be reached. But the man from the Ku Klux Klan was ready to be reached. So he was an enemy whose story I had not yet heard. And so I then, was able to contact the police and the FBI, and he left the Ku Klux Klan, and there was a heavy price for him to pay for leaving, and a heavy price for me to pay as well, but I would do it all over again. So Thich Nhat Hanh believes that deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of another person. You can call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose, and that's to help him or her to empty their heart. There's 5 practices, and I want to go through these briefly, these 5 practices of compassionate listening. And I'm happy to send this to anybody who wants it. But the first one is cultivating compassion. And you've got to cultivate that compassion within yourself and allow that to guide you. You need to anchor your own heart, because you're not going to be able to connect with another person unless you can anchor into your own heart. Instead, we often anchor into our ego. We want to be right, and we want to espouse our rightness. We need to experience and express gratitude and appreciation in that moment for yourself and for others that are at the table. And seek the gifts offered that come with that conflict and that pain. I'm still working on practicing forgiveness of self and others. But I really do try to continue to engage in my own personal work, because we are all healing from some kind of brokenness. The second one is developing fair witness. So what that means is when you're being triggered in that moment, you need to stay centered in that fire, which is really hard to do. Notice that you're getting triggered. And that's where sometimes you have to take those deep breaths, or you need to maybe, leave the room for a moment or two and say, right now I'm triggered, but I want to come back and listen and hear what you have to say. Sometimes I find it's helpful to go to the balcony, try to look at it objectively. Stepping into the other person's shoes is what we're trying to do in that moment. Suspend judgment of yourself and others. I heard a quote on NPR the other day: leap towards compassion and crawl towards judgment. Distinguish the impact of actions from intention. Oftentimes we have good intentions, but we don't understand the impact that it may have on others. Ask questions that reflect non-judgment. Excuse me for forgetting the T on the end there. And maintain a process, continue to maintain that process of self-exploration so that you can be more aware and tap into your wisdom instead of the chatter of your ego. The third practice is respecting self and others. Resist giving advice. We are so good at giving advice, but resist it. Trust each person's ability to solve his or her own problems, their own problems. Discern how one's emotional state impacts the conversation. So in other words, if you come to the table to listen, but you have just come from a conflict with your partner or your spouse or at work, you're not going to be in a good place to listen. So think about your emotional place, the other person's emotional place. Practice self-care and responsibility for your own emotional well-being. And build your ability to stay in the fire. And one of the things I do is I take my fingers and I just cross them and I take in a very, very deep breath and I hold it usually for about 20 seconds and then let that breath out when I feel myself getting triggered. Be respectful of people's differing tolerance levels and capacity for managing conflict. When I first started doing this work, I was very quick to call someone a racist, and that got me nowhere. As soon as we shamed the other person, we lost their ability to have a conversation with them. Hold the intention to do no harm. It doesn't mean you will do no harm, but try to hold that intention and take responsibility. I am a part of what's unfolding. I am not separate from it. And focus on your own emotional and mental state as a way of developing greater understanding of the whole. The fourth is listening from the heart. Anchor in that heart when listening for the deeper qualities beneath the stories that you hear. Try to quiet your mind. Don't make lists in your mind or what it is you want to say, which is what often happens. Stay grounded in your body. Create a spaciousness to manage that tension that's going to come with being triggered by different views and feelings, and offer listening as a gift. Trying not to give your own opinion or your interpretation. And the last one, speaking from the heart. Look for words of understanding and connection. Feel their energy. Be courageous in giving voice to what has truth and meaning. Use language that reflects one's ability to connect to the wholeness of the other. Use language that reflects a healing intention. Identify and capture in words underlying needs. That's a really important one, because oftentimes what people are expressing is fear. Use reflective listening effectively, and that is to be able to try and summarize what you think you heard someone say. Try to name the essence of what it is their concern is, what they're feeling, because often it comes out as anger, but really what they're feeling is fear. If you can, reframe the issue or the need or the situation to promote strength and healing. And here's what I want to get to. We can listen with fact-based listening, which is what we tend to do. We ask questions like, where did that happen? What happened? Where were you? Those are all fact-based listening, and that's what we tend to do in our society. We don't tend to listen for feelings-based. What are you feeling? It sounds like you're scared. It sounds like your anger is coming through, but I think what I'm also hearing is your fear. And values-based listening. This is really, really important. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about values-based listening. So I met a woman named Karen Tibbles, another Quaker. I'm a Quaker at Newtown Friends meeting. And she wrote a book called Restoring Civility Across the Political Divide. And she's done research where she was able to identify these areas that we all share as values: community and belonging, sacredness, purity, fairness and justice, respect for authority, and caring versus harm. But here's what she found. There's different weight put on these things depending upon your political view. So if you're a progressive, a liberal, if you put yourself in that category, you tend to put more weight on belonging and community. You tend to put more weight on fairness and justice. If you're conservative, you tend to put more weight on sacredness and purity, with a focus on purity. You tend to put more, you're heavily weighted on respect for authority, support the police. I'm curious where people would think it's more heavily weighted for either liberals or conservatives with caring versus harm. And you can unmute yourself and give me some some sense of where you think that is.
I think I'm sorry. I think the definition of caring and harm are different for progressives and for conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be very difficult to determine an answer here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The others are a little bit easier to figure out, but the more liberal minded community has a different way of viewing caring. There's more of an understanding of how my intentions impacted you. Conservatives look at, well, my intention wasn't to harm you, and that the weight is on that. I'm not doing any harm. What I'm saying shouldn't be harming you. So I would really recommend the book because it's so interesting to me how our conversations, the way we can listen, is to hold space for where they are with their values. So in other words, asking them questions that are fact-based isn't really going to get you anywhere. If you can tap into their emotions and tap into where their values are, then you have a better chance of trying to get at their fear that comes before their anger. And so that deep listening that we're looking for, holding that container for understanding their values, the other person's values. So if we look at that from a perspective of racism, for example, this respect for, more heavily weighted for authority or police, allows you then to ask more questions related to that value. Or fairness and justice. When someone understands the criminal justice system and how racism is in our criminal justice system, taking that perspective is going to take a little bit of time to explain the criminal justice system, keeping in mind there's respect for authority there for the police. So, we saw this the other night, if anybody watched President Biden's speech, when he talked about funding the police versus defunding the police. And where he could create a bridge was to say, policing as we know it isn't going to work anymore. And so we need to not defund it, but find other ways to support policing so that we involve social workers, mental health people, mediators in neighborhoods that work with the police, being able to put police behind bars when there is racism that has turned into police brutality. So we had an opportunity there to build a bridge because, as you saw, the Republicans stood up when he said, we don't need to defund the police, we need to fund the police. There was a sort of a bipartisan standing, but the nuances needed to be there. So this really understanding the values of the person who is opposite of you is both really difficult and really important if you're going to try and build that bridge to understanding. And oftentimes what I say is, do you want to remain in the relationship or do you want to be right? And Susan, I'll take a question in just a moment. I want to finish my thought here, because we tend to be risk averse. Our species tends to be risk averse. So think about that. If you don't want to have conflict, what are you going to do? You're going to avoid it. And we don't want to be confrontational because we know that that doesn't work. So oftentimes, we, for the sake of harmony in the room, we will be quiet. But just think if we could take apart these questions and these values and their emotions, and could we get further along? Or is that relationship just too toxic for you? Susan, you had a question? You're still on mute.
I have a response. What keeps running through my mind in what you're offering us right now. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it, because the question I'm getting for myself, am I willing? Am I willing? Pardon?
Say that one more time.
Am I willing? Am I willing to take the breath? And am I willing to open to the space of the compassionate listening? And to be honest with myself, that's because spiritual bypassing doesn't really work so well. I tried that a lot in my life. Mm-hmm. And so to just get really honest with myself, and if I'm not willing, say, well, you're not willing. And then there's an energy that I feel inside myself just to kind of pull back to allow, so I'm not, to allow the energy in front of me to be free of my unwillingness, just not to put the junk out there, just kind of energetically move back and just allow and say, I'm not ready. Mm-hmm. And there's times that I'm not, but there's times when I ask that question, it's usually an invitation for me to open the space to be willing. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Can I take that apart a little bit? Because I think that also what's important is the timing. So if in that moment the toxicity is pretty high, it may not be the right moment. And yes, absolutely checking in with yourself. That's important. What's interesting and why I want to take that apart a little bit is sometimes when I've taken the temperature of myself and said, oh, this is going to be really difficult. I don't like the way I'm feeling right now. I don't like the way this is hitting me right now. That's where I've learned I'll be quiet for a few moments, because then what I'm doing is I'm breathing in that fire that's in my belly and in the room right in that moment. And I think about that child that might be watching. And I think, is it going to be better for me to take on this issue that could teach that child a really, really loving lesson? Or might I do more harm in that moment? And so I can't answer that for anybody. It really is a personal thing. But I found that when I did take it on and got attacked, right? I, spoke from my place of love, got attacked, left the room, came back another time, not in that moment, but at another time to address it. So much of it really is in the timing and that other person's energy. So if the other person's energy is really toxic in that moment, you may not be able to make a difference except just being in prayer in that moment. So I get to practice this all the time because I have many of my family members are on the opposite side of where I am. And I want to participate in their lives because I love them, but our values don't match up. So I get practice, a lot of practice. And sometimes I'll go into my car and just cry afterwards, or I might cry that night, but I still keep coming back in that place of love because I just keep thinking about the children that are watching. And I always have nieces and nephews around me that are watching. And I think, do I want them to have, a good role model or a role model that maybe is, the difference is choosing to avoid the conflict because it's really uncomfortable for you is what I want to get people beyond. So it might be a difference between really toxic stuff going on versus I just can't take this on. I wouldn't know what to say. What if they come back with a really, good argument and then I don't know what to do, then I look stupid. I want to get us past that point versus, spiritually, this isn't right for me right now. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. Yes.
And I want to end this with, if we have no peace, it's because we've forgotten we belong to each other. We all know that, but we don't often live it. And I try to think of us with this thread that just connects us all. But because we don't see that thread, we can easily forget that we do not belong, that we do belong to one another. And I found this on Facebook and just loved it. The sunflower with all the hands clasped and the heart in the middle. And I wish I could say who I borrowed it from, but I don't remember. How are we doing time-wise? Did I go over the 20 minutes, Linda?
I think you can, take another minute or two,
Okay.
but that's about it. If there's any other questions or if you
Well,
have anything.
if I could end with just, here are things to consider when you are thinking about what to ask someone, or you ask yourself with whom you disagree. Where do you find hope in this situation? Do you sense any unmet needs in the situation? If the situation were resolved, how would your life be different? What is your source of courage? What do we lose when we judge each other? How do we bring compassion to ourselves? And what is the value you hold dear? And how does it feel when your values are being challenged or attacked? So if nothing else, those are some of the questions you can ask the other person. And that keeps you in your spiritual, you don't have to do the bypass, So I would love to have comments, questions,